Hey guys, it's Camus, and welcome to round 4 of Mike Basman's performance in the recent Four Nations Chess League Individual Rapid event. And let's get started. In this game, he's playing Simon Dayton, who's an expert. And let's see how the game began. His opponent played d4, and Basman plays b5, e4, and bishop to b7. Now this is similar to the St. George defense. It starts out as Polish, but Basman doesn't really play the Polish anymore. He did years ago. Usually he plays a6 in this position, but he's trying an interesting gambit idea. His opponent decides to shut down any tricks on the long diagonal, plays f3, and now after a6, we have a more or less normal, if you can call such an opening normal, St. George. His opponent plays a very provocative c4. This is the 3 pawns attack variation in the St. George. This is perhaps not the best chance against Basman, considering that Basman has an entire chapter devoted to this variation in the St. George book. So anyway, he plays, Basman that is, e6. And white takes the offered pawn. C takes b5, a takes b5, bishop takes b5. Black is gambiting a pawn here for some activity, some open lines. There are some superficial resemblances to the Benko gambit. One of the points of this particular system is the free development of the queen's rook. Now in the database I have 7 games, and from this position Black has only scored 2.5 points. So the soundness is questionable, but certainly a good choice for rapid play. And as I've stated in other videos, Basman knows these positions inside and out. Basman plays queen to h4, and that's greeted by the normal g3, and queen to h5. Continue to put pressure on this white diagonal. His opponent plays knight to c3, and Basman gets his bishop out, bishop to b4, pinning the knight. Now his opponent seems to be worrying about the soundness of his central structure, so he retreats the bishop to d3. And now Basman is not one to wait for the grass to grow. He plays f5, leading to a fascinating position here. Now, probably the most testing choice for white in this position would have been queen to b3, and we might have had something like this. Now you can see there's a direct threat to the bishop on b4, and behind it the bishop on b7, so knight to c6 is forced here. d5 is logical, takes, and now knight to e5 is the saving move here. Cannot take the bishop without losing his queen to knight takes d3, bishop to e2, c5, d takes c6, knight takes c6, bishop to e3, knight to f6, a3, bishop takes c3, check, queen takes c3, castles, and we have a pretty crazy position where white is holding his extra pawn, but black does have some compensation here. Now he didn't play this. After f5, he could have also played e takes f5. Basman could have played e takes f5, and maybe something like bishop f4, d6, a3, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, knight to e7. White looks okay here. Basman would have a little bit of compensation. I can't put myself into the mind of Basman, but I have played through a lot of his games. I imagine he would have probably played, after e takes f5, he would have played knight to f6 instead, throwing a couple other logs on the fire. F takes e6, castles, e takes d7, knight b to d7, queen to b3 check, knight to d5 is forced, bishop to d2, rook to a to e8 check, bishop to e2, knight 7 to b6, castles queenside, king to h8. Now in this position, black is down 3 pawns, but has a lot of compensation and activity. Ribka considers that despite the 3-pawn deficit, that black is almost equal here. So, of course, none of this actually happened. After f5, his opponent chose queen to e2. Black got on with it with knight to f6, and then knight to c6 was probably worth considering in this position too. His opponent played bishop to d2. He could have played e5, but after knight to d5, bishop to d2, castles, a4, knight to b6, b3, as the pawn was attacked, knight to c6, knight to b5, bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2, knight to a5, hitting the b pawn, queen to f2, because there was also a threat on f3, knight takes b3. Black has recovered his pawn and has a decent position. So after knight to f6, he didn't play e5, he played bishop to d2. I guess another possibility here, before we go on with the main line, after knight to f6, he could have played e takes f5, castles, f takes e6, rook to e8, pinning the pawn, bishop to c4, putting a counter pin in, bishop to d5, king to f2, getting out of one pin, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, rook takes e6, queen to f1. White is holding his pawn, but Ribka considers that black is actually better here. You can see black has obvious activity, the white king is misplaced, and things look pretty rosy for an attacking scenario. Okay, so back to the game. After knight to f6, he didn't play any of that. He played bishop to d2. Basman castles. And now white makes his first mistake. He's probably panicking about the concentration of forces directed in the general direction of his king, so he decides to get out of dodge. He castles queenside. Again, he could have played e5. And Ribka suggests this line as being good for white, but interestingly enough, as the line progresses, the positional evaluation starts creeping up into black's favor. The sample line that Ribka suggested was knight to d5, a4, knight to b6, b3, similar to the other line we looked at, knight c6, queen to f2, d6, e takes d6, bishop takes d6, knight to b5, rook f to d8, a5, and now e5 with full compensation, according to Ribka. At the beginning of this line, Ribka considered that white was almost 2 pawns up, but here we are with dynamically equal position. Okay, so after black castled back to the game, white made this inaccuracy, castles queenside. So sort of getting out of the frying pan and getting into the fire, because things are not any safer on the queen side with these 2 open files. This bishop on b4, this rook on a8, going to be troublesome. Now Basman completes his development with knight to c6, which is a fine move and one of Ribka's top choices. But Ribka also suggests bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, rook takes a2. Very simple line, and black has a serious advantage here. But there's certainly nothing wrong with knight to c6 either. And I'm sure Basman saw this line and just wanted to get his knight developed. d5 was played. Now knight to d4, dangerous incursion by the black knight here. Queen to f2, getting out of the way, and now c5. It's a good move. Basman forces the prying open of more lines because the knight simply cannot be allowed to remain here anchored on d4. So d takes c6 is more or less forced, and now the knight recaptures. And now we have 3 open files looking in the general direction of white's king. This cannot be good. At this point, it's actually very difficult to find decent moves for white. in the game, his opponent played king to b1. Very natural looking move, getting out of the open file. But this doesn't work out well. His best chance was probably e takes f5, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight to e5, queen to d4, knight to f3, knight takes f3, bishop takes f3, picking up the exchange, and we still have something of an attack against the white king. This is almost winning for black, but it was better than what happened in the game. So after knight to c6, as I said, white played king to b1. And now Basman finds all the right moves. Knight to e5. Now the bishop is hanging on d3, so he plays bishop to e2, which is another mistake. Again, he's picking moves that look natural, but actually are not good. So he should have played bishop to c2, and then black would have played f takes e4, opening a line towards the white queen, g4, queen to f7, g5, knight to d5, knight takes e4, knight to c4, knight to e2, and black still has quite an advantage here, but white is still on the board. Okay, so back to the game. After knight to e5, as I said, he didn't play bishop to c2, he played bishop to e2, probably a move that many of us would make in a similar position. And now, after f takes e4, Rybka considers that white is now lost. There are many ways for black to win, and Basman has no difficulty in finding a strong winning line here. After f takes e4 by white, plays queen to g6, heating up insurmountable pressure on this e-pawn. Knight to d5 is played in desperation, but this is simply a losing blunder, because after knight takes d5, notice that the pawn is pinned on e4, cannot recapture the knight. He plays queen to d4, as the queen was attacked by the discovery of the knight with the rook against f2. So he had to play queen to d4. Now knight to c6, queen to d3, bishop to a6, and white resigned. The pressure is just simply too much to bear. The queen is attacked, and he doesn't have very many places he can go. If he tries queen to c2, for instance, after knight to d4, hitting the queen again, as well as the bishop on e2, and again, he has little in the way of escape squares. If he goes to a4, for instance, bishop to d3 picks up the queen, and if he goes to c1, queen to e4 check, leads to a quick mate after king to a1, knight to b3 check, forcing a takes b3, bishop takes e2, and that's checkmate. So actually a very nice game from Basman, and he's not afraid to sacrifice pawns to get an attacking position. This is my favorite of the games that we've looked at so far, and we've got one more game, and we'll see how he does in that. Thus far he's got, out of 4 games, he has 3 points, I believe, and he was almost winning against Hebden, so he didn't win this tournament, but he came very close, and not bad for a guy who's 67 years old. Okay, well, I hope you'll tune in for the exciting conclusion, round 5, whenever I get round to it. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.